السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم أما بعد. So I wanted to welcome everyone here to this Sapiens Live session. We're going to be, inshallah, speaking about the topic of experiential signs, how to use people's spiritual experiences to help them find the truth. Now, this particular topic, it's of interest to me specifically because, recently I was with someone and I asked them. I said, if someone came to you and asked you to define or to explain Islamic spirituality, how would you do it? And and this was a room full of what I would say, practicing Muslims who are passionate about their faith and so on. And they really had a diverse range of answers. Whereas when I presented the question, how would you introduce Islam to someone, just as a general principle, they had kind of your standardized, Tawheed, starting with Allah, Allah's worthy of worship, and so on and so forth. So that kind of led me to really think deeper about the concept of spirituality within Islam, and then how we can use spirituality or spiritual experiences as a tool to invite people, to encourage people to think about the truth of Islam. So, with that said, what are we going to be speaking about today? Well, what we're going to be covering in this topic in today's session, we're going to be looking at why this particular topic and why now. Why is it more important than ever that we understand this topic in a way that we're able to articulate it properly, that we ourselves understand it, and that we're inviting humanity to Islam as it is, as the normative understanding of Islam. And we'll get into that in a second, because one of the things that I'll be reasoning, what I'll be speaking about, is that a normative understanding of Islam devoid of a concept of spirituality is in fact not really an appropriate method, because it is only giving someone a piecemeal understanding of Islam. It's not holistic, okay? But I'll get into that. So we're going to start off with understanding why this topic and why now. So we'll look at it. We'll look at our contemporary world. We'll look at specifically spirituality and spiritual experiences, how people are craving deeper spirituality, and so on. Then the second part we will move on to, or the second section, we're going to be looking at our current approaches. When we, as Muslims or people that are interested in inviting people to the truth, inviting people to Islam, what are the current approaches that are being used, and how are they, how do they compare with a more holistic understanding of Islam, and where can we perhaps improve in that? We're then going to move on to the concept of Islamic spirituality itself. Like I mentioned, I had a conversation with a group of people, and I asked them what Islamic spirituality was, and there was such a diversity of answers that I was a bit taken aback. Even though, if I asked some of you what is Islamic spirituality, you might actually be able to give a pretty succinct, pithy answer and say, well, this is Islamic spirituality. But nevertheless, I think it's important that we ourselves, if it's true that we can use spirituality and people's spiritual experiences as a way to call people to the truth, to invite people to Islam, then it's very important that we ourselves have a good understanding of what Islamic spirituality is. So that is what we'll cover in the third section. Now, after understanding what Islamic spirituality is, we're going to look at the ontology of the soul. And what I mean here, in fact, is more, perhaps it should be better titled the ontology of the human being. Because while we may understand conceptually what Islamic spirituality is, if we don't understand the nature of the human being and its connection with the soul and the body and so on and so forth, our excuse me, our understanding may be one that we're not able to articulate Islamic spirituality as it should be articulated. So we'll get into that in the fourth section. The fifth section, we're going to take an example of a spiritual experience, in the sense that we'll look at a couple of approaches of how to use spiritual experiences. One of those approaches is going to be, how can we invite people to spiritual acts that we as Muslims do, and to partake in those acts and partake in some of those acts with a good understanding of Islamic spirituality. So we'll have an example of one of those spiritual experiences or spiritual acts, let's say, that are inside the Islamic paradigm, Islamic worldview. The second thing would be, what about someone that has their own spiritual experience? A Christian has their spiritual experience, or a Buddhist has their spiritual experiences. How do we then deal with that? And how do we use that as a means to call people to the truth or invite people to Islam? So that's, in general, that's where we'll be going in this particular presentation, inshallah. So I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it a means to our betterment, both in this dunya and the akhirah. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept it from all of us and all of you that are out there, inshallah. Okay, so why this topic and why now? Well, one of the things that we see, that within the modern world, you find that people have many distractions, have many things that that are part and parcel of the modern world, that cause the human being to almost live a type of insular, cerebral, cold life, right? So we, in the modern world, we have access to a lot of information right at our fingertips. We have access to comforts and things that we would consider, very, certain eases within the modern world that we could never imagine, 50, 60, 100, 200 years ago. So a lot of those aspects of the modern world, many would argue that causes the human being a type of discomfort. So you could be on your cell phone and you could be, let's say, looking for that particular text, or you receive a certain text, you put your phone down, but then you get a notification. And research has shown that notification is somewhat more or less equivalent to getting it's the phenomena of getting a notification is somewhat similar to taking a type of drug or having a type of high. So the same phenomena occurs within the chemicals within the brain. And so when you get that text, you're looking for the next text or the next email or the next, and the notifications prompt that. So you're constantly looking from one social media outlet to another, one email account to another. And so this process keeps on going. But the reality is that while you get that first dopamine shot, that again is many researchers would say that's equivalent to certain drugs that also give that excrete dopamine, that it's not satisfying. And so I think the researcher, and so you can see here within the images, you've got obviously the gaming on the cell phone. That's a cause for this insular, atomized lifestyle in the modern world. But not only that, just the phenomena of the modern world as well, in the sense that you have things that happen around the world that can also cause a person to be unstable internally, in the sense that they're looking for something deeper when it comes to their life, meaning, and so on and so forth. So you have wars around the world, for instance, that are proliferating and that are happening all the time. You have certain social causes that add to this type of anxiety, where a person is looking for a deeper meaning or deeper understanding of themselves and the world that they live in. And just the phenomena of the environment of us having a type of consumer mentality, where it's going from one product to the next, buying one thing to the next. And I think it's summarized really well, just the phenomena of modernity, with this statement from Lawrence Shamies. And he writes in The Hunger for More, Searching for Values in an Age of Greed, He says, consumption without excuses and without the need of justification. And so here he's talking about a certain phenomena of the modern world, and that has to do with consumption. And so he says, consumption without excuses and without the need for justification. The beauty part was that it finessed the irksome question of values and purpose. So during the past decade, many people came to believe that there didn't have to be a purpose. The mechanism didn't require it. In other words, the consumer mechanism didn't require that you needed a teleology. You didn't need a purpose and meaning and all of these deeper things like the idea of consumerism or the idea of the modern world. You could do away with any concept of, what happens next. What are things meaningful? Is there a purpose to my existence, my life, and so on and so forth? So what he's stating is during the past decade, many people came to believe that there didn't have to be a purpose. The mechanism didn't require it. Consumption kept the workers working, which kept the paychecks coming, which kept the people spending, which kept the investors investing, which meant that there was more to consume. The system, properly understood, was independent of values and needed no philosophy to prop it up. It was a perfect circle. It was a perfect circle, complete in itself, but empty in the middle. And I think it's very profound how he explained that, because in our day and age, we see more and more people feeling that emptiness and feeling that idea that yes, I can go to work and come back and eat my TV dinner and sit in front of Netflix and chill and whatever it might be. But all of this is just a rat race that goes round and round. Every day is, just another day. And so that emptiness starts to now gnaw at the human being. Now, because that emptiness starts to gnaw at the human being, we have to ask, what is that thing that's gnawing at the human being? What is it that, what is that dissatisfaction? And the 9th century scholar, Ibn Hazm, al-Andalusi, he was a Muslim theologian. He was you would say a polymath, very erudite scholar who comes out of Muslim Spain in the 9th century. And he has this statement, which I thought was very profound. He said, I have tried to find one goal which everyone would agree would be excellent and worthy of being striven after. I found only one. What was that goal? He says, to be free of hum. And hum, I've given a brief translation here, anxiety, but I'm going to speak about that in a second as well. So he says, dispelling hum is a goal upon which all nations agree. In the case of every other objective, there will always be some people who do not desire it. For example, there are some who have no interest in amassing a fortune, preferring abstinence to ownership. So his understanding and his prognosis of the problem is that thing that's needed, that hole within the human being, is and the problem that people are feeling is the problem of hum. So what does he mean by hum, or what does the word hum mean? So Lane's lexicon defines it as follows: that hum is anxiety, that's kind of a one-word answer, or disquietude, or trouble of mind. And this is very important because what we're going to see as we move forward is that one of the things that Islamic spirituality provides is a type of freeing from a trouble of the soul and a trouble of the mind. And what exactly speaking about? So coming back to the definition of hum, he says hum is anxiety or disquietude, trouble of the mind, solicitude, care or grief or sorrow, distress or disquietude affecting the heart or mind by reason of some harm or annoyance that is expected to happen. And this is a really important distinction between hum and gham. So he says, and he actually mentions that next, he says, differing from gham, which signifies distress or disquietude affecting the heart or mind by reason of what has happened. So we notice that you have this concept of certain occurrences that are happening or what have happened in the past, let's say, that is what you will call gham, when you feel something about things that happened in the past. But what hum really is this idea when you start reflecting upon what's happening to you now and what's going to happen in the future. And we start looking at the future and saying, it's all just empty. I'm just a cog in a machine, right? And I personally think that in the COVID environment where many of us were truly atomized in the sense that we had this existence that became extremely insular and solitary. We were very alone in many cases, that this idea of hum became exacerbated. We felt more of it, right? And so hum, as opposed to gham, hum is related to that which is about your current situation or the future. When you look to the future and it's bleak, you're just day in, day out. So where does a person go, and where's the deeper satisfaction and deeper, like where is this all going? And like I said, as opposed to gham, which is things that happen in the past or occurrences that happen, the death of a loved one, whatever it might be. So we have this problem. It's reached a very extreme level in the modern day and age, right? So now enter the modern gurus. Obviously, if there's a problem, you're going to find people rushing to give a solution to that problem and truth. And so what I have here is a picture of a number of prominent, you can say, modern gurus. So, and I'm sure you'll recognize some of them at least, right? Here in Houston, you've got Joel Osteen. He's a Christian preacher, but a lot of his talk is all about, you and hope, and that you can do it, and you can get there by the will of Jesus, and so on and so forth. And so, he's giving this deeper solution, which what you'll notice is when you hear when he's speaking, he's not necessarily giving very robust, deep academic arguments or deep academic dissertations about how to solve this emptiness. But a lot of it is almost, you can say, superficial talk, just kalam fadi, as they say, right? But yet it kind of inspires people. So every Sunday, people would come to the church or tune in on TV, and he would have these messages of hope and the future, and it's bright, and Jesus is with you, and so on and so forth. With what goal or what understanding? The understanding that humans in modernity are craving that. Similarly, you have a YouTube sensation, I would say, Sadhguru. Now he's coming from an Indian paradigm, or let's say a Hindu paradigm. And so, but yet, what is he presenting? It's all about the self and sitting still, solitude, and all of these various ideas. Again, it's there because he understands, like Joel Osteen understands, that there is this human need, and human beings are craving this, especially in modernity. And of course, the last one is Tony Robbins. So you're talking about, someone that is outside the context of a religion or a specific philosophy, but it's just more of that, self-help, feel good, you can do it, and the future is yours, and so on and so forth. Now, that being the case, what we want to ask is, where does Islam fit into all of this? Like, when we want to invite people to Islam, there is a deeper spiritual need. There is a deeper spiritual calling that people have. There is a disquietude. There's anxiety. There is a hum. And what is very unfortunate is that within our tradition, we have a deeply spiritual tradition. But when we look at our own approaches to how we deal with the concept of dawah, or inviting people to the truth, or encouraging people, or helping someone to find the truth, we find that many times it's almost cold and clinical, because we are so focused on the argument, or we're so focused on, a type of that we want to make Islam just be very rational. And so we're going to now employ various means of discursive reasoning to say, look, you have, premise A, premise B, therefore C. that sometimes we miss out on the fact that we're not talking to a machine, but we're talking to a human being that has a multitude of emotions and psychospiritual states and opinions and and worldviews, paradigms, cultures, and so much that goes on within the human project. And we tend to hyper focus, many of us tend to hyper focus on one element that almost makes Islam seem just, again, cold, cerebral, clinical. So therefore we have this human machine, and we're going to input certain information. So we have information: Allah is one, the only one worthy of worship, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, proofs of prophethood, dara, the shahada. Right now they've been guided, when in reality, we may be missing the bigger picture. So, what I wanted to look at next was comparing or in many circles, the current environment or the current understanding of what people generally think dawah is, or what people think sharing Islam is, or sharing the truth, or inviting someone to the truth, or helping someone finding the truth, what is somewhat prevalent. And perhaps this has to do with the modern age itself, that we ourselves are affected by that sort of consumer, cold, cerebral, view of the world, that we've been kind of put into the position where we have limited the invitation to Islam to just debate and just kind of being able to show the superiority of Islam by putting down another person or whatever it might be. And again, you're going to see this, and I'm not knocking debate in its entirety. Obviously, it has a benefit. It has there's certain times when debate is necessary, but a lot of times we have now become myopic in how we understand inviting someone to the truth. So it goes from this kind of caring, warm, welcoming phenomena to one that becomes almost cold, abstruse, almost that it's just full of debate, right? It's full of kind of just argumentation, jidal, right? Yet when we look at it, we're actually inviting a complete human being. So the two approaches, you have one that's quite prevalent, which we would call functionalism, right? So functionalism, it's represented by that robot that's on my right side of the screen. So functionalism is a view of the human being that has a type of understanding of the person you're speaking to be like a robot. So what is a robot? It's programmed, right? So there's an input, there's an output. There's no sort of reflection or contemplation. There's no feeling, no emotions. It's just you have, a certain input, certain premises, certain conclusion, deductive reasoning, discursive reasoning, whatever it might be, and then boom, you have an output. But in reality, the human being is not just pre-programmed and does not lack reflection, contemplation, feelings, and emotion. Rather, the human being is a complex network of the aql, right? The intellect, the nafs, the desires, and that base desires, the ruh, the spirit or the soul within the human being, that consciousness, the qalb, the heart, the fitra, as we're going to speak about, and that this human being is extremely deep and extremely multivaried, and it has it's very complex. So when we look at the human being, even when we look at our tradition, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when describing the human being, doesn't just say that this is a thinking being. Now, I'm not saying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't mention that we are thinking beings. Of course, we're always encouraged to think, to ponder. Afala taqilun, do they not use their reasoning? But Allah describes a human being in many ways. And some of those ways have to do with that with that disquietude, and the reasons for that disquietude. So, for example, how does Allah describe the human being? He says in one in that first ayah that I mentioned here, وَكَانَ الْإِنسَانُ أَكْثَرَ شَيْءٍ جَدَلًا. The human being loves to argue. In another place in the Quran, Surah Al-Kahf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. We've only given you just a minuscule little bit of knowledge. And so with that little knowledge, how does Allah describe the human being? Well, he loves to argue, right? Little bit of knowledge, but based on that little bit of knowledge, loves to argue. That's just, whether the person, you know, uh, do they know the entirety of the other human being they're speaking to? Do they know their complete background? Do they know that this person was abused as a child? Whatever it might be, all the background, the human being loves to argue, right? The human being is in haste. وَكَانَ الْإِنسَانُ عَجُولًا, right? That the human being is constantly in a hurry. That rat race I was speaking about, that's, something that we that things, we want things done quickly and immediately. And so now it's just, we're always in this rat race, this idea of just taking some time out and calming oneself to think deeper. When someone is in that circle that I was speaking about earlier, or that Lawrence Shamies was speaking about earlier, that being caught up in that circle, it's part of the human condition. The human being is anxious. Again, anxiety, right? Innal insana khuliqa halua. Indeed, the human being is created anxious, right? Mankind is indeed created anxious. إِذَا مَسَّهُ الشَّرُّ جَزُوعًا. And when some sort of evil touches him, right? This goes back to gham versus ham. When some sort of evil touches him, he's impatient. Oh man, this is like, my world's about to be destroyed. I don't know what's going to happen. And all of these, my world has come crumbling down. But then what happens when good comes? وَإِذَا مَسَّهُ خَيْرُ مَنُوعًا. But when that good comes, they withhold it. They get greedy with it, right? And such is the human being, right? Little bit of knowledge and making conclusions, arguing, argumentative, being impatient, being anxious, withholding good, being very impatient when evil touches the human being. The human being is complex, right? Okay, so coming to these two these two concepts we were talking about. Tao of Functionalism. So a functional approach to the Tao addresses the human being with a mind that functions as a series of inputs and outputs. So you basically approach the human being as a computer. What's the assumption here? The assumption is that Tao is based on abstract rational arguments and that they are sufficient to produce the results. All right. So it's similar to an algorithm. So you have these, algorithms that you've basically put out. And so, or you have algorithms, much like how the internet works today, right? There's a series of algorithms, and that's how they kind of give an avatar. So social media works by making avatars, and then they basically look at your buying preferences. Where do you live? What is your age? What is your political affiliation? What are some of your opinions? And all of that data is gathered together, and then there is an avatar that's created. So therefore, and then you have algorithms, you have information that comes together with this avatar to then target you as a human being. But this is a very, again, cold, cerebral approach. And much of the time when we are inviting people to Islam, our approach is very similar, right? So this approach fails to address the human in a holistic way. Human beings are not only rational, in fact, they are a dynamic interplay between emotions, psychology, cognitive faculties, and I would add to that spirituality. We're psycho-spiritual emotive beings. Let's compare that now, looking at that and comparing that and juxtaposing that with Dawa holism. Dawa holism, a holistic approach to the Dawa that addresses the human being as he is, as the human being is. Allah knows the human being better than we know the human being, right? So he created us. That being said, we understand that the human being has an intellect, it has a heart, it has a fitra, as we'll get into in a second. It has a nafs, a body, a ruh, and so on and so forth. Okay. So let's now start. So if that's the case, if we understand that the human being is a complex interplay of emotions and psycho-spiritual states and culture and background and cognition. So I don't want to, basically say that cognition has no part to play. Obviously, the human being has cognitive faculties, and using those cognitive faculties will become very important, especially when we get to the end of today's live seminar and we speak about the various understandings of spiritual experiences. Because we can't just do away with cognition, but at the same time, we cannot just hyper focus on cognition itself. with and leave off the rest of the human emotive psycho-spiritual interplay. So let's take a brief look at the human being. And I say brief because we have covered a lot of these topics in uh, other courses that are available on YouTube, and other sapient thought series that I know myself I've done. So I'm going to briefly look at the construct of the human being to give us a good idea about what is the human being, right? What do we mean by the human being from an Islamic paradigm? So the first thing we understand, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Ma min mawludin illa yuladu ala al-fitra." There is no child that is born except that they are born upon the fitra. His parents then make him a Jew, a Christian, or a Magian. As an animal delivers a child with limbs intact, do you detect any flaw? And so, one of the first things we understand about the human being when we're speaking about what or who is the human, right? You can even say that we're talking about the anthropology, not anthropology as we understand it in Western academia, but who or what is the human. So, from that perspective, we understand one of the first things is that every single human being is born upon the fitra. Now, what do we mean by the term fitra? So, if you've heard, any sort of talks or live streams from Sapiens, and if you've been following Sapiens, you know that we speak about this very often. So that's why I don't want to spend too much time on it. But for purposes of today's live stream, I'm just going to present a working definition. I've actually presented this in a lot more detail in a Sapient Thought series called The Human Project. So if you'd like more information, you can check it out there. But for today's purposes, the working definition we'll say is the original. What is the fitra? It is the original normative disposition. And I'm using three words there: original, normative, disposition. So what this hadith tells us is that it is original. It is the original way in which Allah created the human being. The term fitra is what we call an ismul hayya in terms of, if you study Arabic grammar, which signifies how something is or the way something is. So you have similar terms, like you have obviously fitra, you have khilqa, the way something is created, jilsa, the way, the sitting, how someone sits, or the sitting or the gathering. Then you have the one that many Muslims are familiar with, qibla, the way you turn, the direction you turn, qibla, fitra, jilsa, khilqa, and so on. So these terms are about the way, the original state, and the original normative disposition. So here, what we're saying when we're looking at the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that originally this is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the human being, was upon the fitra. It is an original state. Okay. Second, so we talked about original normative disposition. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَأَقِمْ وَجْهَكَ لِلدِّينِ حَنِيفًا. So direct your face towards the religion inclining to truth. Here, Hanifa or Hanif, it's this idea of inclining towards the truth. The term Hanif, it's a bit difficult to translate. And then Allah says, فِطْرَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي فَطَرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهَا. It is the fitra, right, of the fitra of Allah, or the fitra that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created all people. And then Allah says, "La tabdila li khalqillah." There is no change should there be in the creation of Allah. In other words, this state, or this original primordial state of the human being, that it cannot be replaced with something altogether. So the word here, just very quickly, for those of you who might be interested, the word here is tabdil. So had the word been tughayyar, in other words, to change, then we would say that the fitra itself cannot be changed, cannot be corrupted. But tabdil means to take something and completely replace it. And so therefore, the fitra, there can be changes. It can be affected, as we're going to see. It can be clouded, but it can never be completely replaced. There's no tabdil in the khalq of Allah, right? There's no tabdil in the fitra. So this is the way that Allah created the human being. Like I said, the fitra, the term itself is an ismul hayya, which means, it is the way, the direction, how Allah created something. The second term there, which I mentioned, was normative. And when we say normative, what we're speaking about here, we can compare it to the term descriptive. Okay, so just bear with me for a minute. When we talk about something normative, we're saying how something should be. How is it in, let's say, reality? What is the normal way of understanding something? Descriptive is how others may describe that particular thing. So if let's say we want to take a normative understanding of Islam, it's basically how Islam describes itself. What does Islam say about itself? If we want to take a descriptive understanding of Islam, that would mean, well, let's present Islam to someone in, let's say, Midland, Texas, and what is their perception of Islam? They may say, oh, Islam is just a whole bunch of rules, and there's these people that commit terrorist acts or whatever it might be. That's a descriptive way of looking at it. But what does Islam say about itself? What is the normative, normal understanding, right? So you have normative, that which is kind of the reality or kind of the normal way something is. And then you have that which is away from that. So the way the human being is as it was originally created to be, the normative state, right? As it is, as Allah created it, this is the second part of our definition. So the original, normative, and then we'll move on to the third point, and that is disposition. So, in other words, there is a certain disposition that the human being has. It was original, it's normative, as it should be, right? And by the way, this term, just to maybe elucidate it a little more, the term normative is quite prevalent in our current culture as well, at least within current Western culture, when we are dealing with things like gender issues, things like the LGBTQ issues and things like that, because they speak about normative. So if you said you're cis normative, for instance, cis normative means that you believe that there are two genders. You believe that is normal, that is the normative, normal way that the human being is, that there are two genders. Similarly, you may say that you are heteronormative. You believe that the normal state of the human being is one of heterosexuality as opposed to homosexuality, and so on and so forth. So from that perspective, it just kind of elucidates the point of what we mean by normative, the normal way in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created. And that normal way has a disposition. Now, there's two main views related to this particular disposition. And that is, number one, that this fitrah, it contains primary inborn knowledge of Allah's existence and that He deserves to be worshipped, right? And it includes some basic morals as well, that we are born with this, right? The second opinion amongst our theologians is that the fitrah does not contain knowledge itself, but it contains you can say it is the means by which you can get to knowledge, you can get to truth. It directs one towards the truth, right? There's a potency that one has that's disposed towards a recognition of Allah and that He alone is worthy of worship. So the fitrah itself has a potency within it to recognize God and a propensity, or that it's primed to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. So now, whichever opinion one takes, we can understand that fitrah, the original normative disposition, when it comes to the world that we live in, when it comes to modernity, when it comes to being brought up in a household that's, let's say, of a different worldview, this fitrah can become clouded. And so when that fitrah is clouded, you find that the objective of the person, of the one who's interested in guiding the person back to the truth, is to deal with those clouds, to remove those clouds, to have the person that they've moved away from that original normative disposition and bring them back to that true normative, original normative disposition, that primordial state of theirs that is true, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the human being. So how is this done? What is the process by which we do this? And this is, at its core, this is what dawah is about. This is what, helping someone find the truth is about. It's about unclouding the fitrah. So that being said, there are a number of ways that one can uncloud the fitrah, right? One of those is revelation, being exposed to the Quran, being exposed to the beauty of the Quran, the the auditory beauty of the Quran, the cadence of the Quran, the words of the Quran, the deeper meanings of the Quran, reflecting upon the Quran, and so on and so forth, or even just the the acoustics of the Quran can also have an effect on removing the clouds or removing these type of clouds on the fitrah. Rational arguments, and this becomes really important. So when we're speaking about Tao holism versus Tao functionalism, rational arguments, again, we're not just throwing them on the side, but we're saying they are not. They are a way to remove the clouds upon the fitrah, right? One of them, but it's not the end all and be all, right? So rational arguments, we're not putting them aside, but they can be a means to removing the clouds upon the fitrah. Spiritualities, what we're going to be speaking about today, or spiritual experiences, one's character, how you approach the person you're speaking to, critical thinking, how a person can kind of think critically about things, experiences, experiencing the natural world, experiencing beauty, positive experiences, negative experiences, and so on. All of that can be ways to uncloud the fitrah. And the reason these clouds come upon the fitrah, or these barriers come upon the fitrah, or the fitrah is kind of moved from its original normative disposition to somewhere else, the reason that happens, there's a number of reasons. So number one, it can be one's upbringing, one's environment. It can also be sins, as we're going to see when we speak about the ontology of the soul. And there's a number of reasons these clouds form. Point being is that one of the ways in which these clouds can be taken off, that you can guide a person or help someone find the truth, is by spiritual experiences, is by understanding spirituality and inviting people to experience certain spiritual practices, and also giving the person an explanation of spiritual experiences that they've had, which may be an alternative to the explanation that they think is that they think is the correct explanation. And we'll get into that a little bit later. Okay, so let's start off with this. What is Islamic spirituality? All right, so now I wanted to ask you guys to make it somewhat interactive. If someone asked you what is Islamic spirituality, what would you say? Give me some on YouTube here. What are some of the how do you define Islamic spirituality? If someone says, okay, does Islam have spirituality? What does Islam say about spirituality? What do you think? Bismillah. Maybe okay. Okay. So that's very good. Actually, someone hit the nail right on the head. I'm not going to say who, but you guys have the right idea, definitely, right? So the person who said the right thing, they're going to find out in a few minutes that they were right. Inshallah. Okay, so let's take a look. What is Islamic spirituality? What do we mean by that? Now, Islamic spirituality, just very briefly, it's something that's defined by the Prophet ﷺ himself. In the very famous hadith of Jibreel alayhi salam, if you remember that, it's very extensive, so I'm not going to go into the entire hadith, and nor am I going to get into a deep explanation of the hadith. But we understand that in this, what many scholars would consider a foundational hadith, the Prophet ﷺ expounds upon three things: Islam, Iman, and Ihsan. So just briefly, the hadith, and it's got various narrators, and anyway, so the hadith mentions that someone comes into a gathering where the companions are sitting with the Prophet ﷺ. This person is wearing white clothing, black hair, comes right up to the Prophet ﷺ, walks up to the Prophet ﷺ, sits down, puts his hands on the legs or the thighs of the Prophet ﷺ, and starts asking questions. And so one of those questions is, Akhbarni annal Islam. Tell me about Islam. The Prophet ﷺ expounds upon the 5 pillars of Islam, as we know, right? And so again, I'm not going to get into too many details. And then the person says, Sadaqt, you've spoken the truth. And then the narrator, one of the narrators, Umar ibn Khattab, says, I found it very strange that he's asking the question, and yet he's saying that you're right. And then Jibreel alayhi salam asked the Prophet ﷺ about Iman. أخبرني عن الإيمان. Tell me about Iman. The Prophet ﷺ mentioned the 6 pillars of Iman, right? To believe in Allah, the angels, the prophets, the books, and so on and so forth. Okay, and then again, Jibreel, or the person says, Sadaqt, you've spoken the truth. And then he asks the Prophet ﷺ about ihsan. Tell me about ihsan. What is ihsan? And the Prophet ﷺ says that ihsan is to worship Allah as if you see him. For even though you do not see him, you know that he sees you. O kama qala sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so when we speak about Islamic spirituality, we see that it's in this area of what we would call ihsan. And ihsan is quite it's a very deep concept. But let's try to at least scratch the surface, inshallah. So we'll start, before we get to ihsan, let's start with the concept of iman first. Okay? Iman, if we look at the etymology of the word, where the word comes from, what is the background of the word, what is the source of the word, it comes from the trilateral amana. And so when we go to like Lane's lexicon yet again, amana refers to he was or became or felt secure, safe, in a state of security or safety. Originally, he was or became quiet, tranquil in heart or mind. So I want us to take a moment here and think about that for a second. When we look at the word iman, we understand that iman is this internal, what we may call belief, right? Even though belief is a very loose translation, which I'm not very fond of, but it has to do with things about, like, obviously the 6 pillars of belief, right? Believing in Allah, the angels, the books, and so on and so forth. But from a linguistic point of view, when we look at the etymology of the word, we see that it comes from this idea of stability, security, tranquility, and peace. When we were speaking about the concept of the concept of this disquietude, this anxiety, what we find is that what iman does is it's giving the appropriate medicine for that, right? It exactly what iman is to take away is to settle it's to get, is to take that person that's in that state, that they're, that they have this state of anxiety, they have this state of, that they're disquieted, uh, and so on, and gives and kind of solves that issue, right? So iman is a person, when they have this iman, when they have this type of internal belief, the 6 pillars that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned, and what we understand about iman, you find that there is a type of tranquility and peace that enters into the human being. Now, that tranquility and peace could be due to understanding deeper existential questions. Why am I here? Where am I going? And how did I get here? Right? So, how did I get here? Like, what is my purpose? Why do I exist? Having the answers to those questions and having iman in those answers gives one a sense of stability, a sense of security, a sense of tranquility. Thus, when someone is faced with, let's say, challenges in one's life, where we move from ham to gham, you find that they can deal with those challenges in a way that a person that does not have that iman can deal with, right? So iman, what it does is it gives this sense of stability, security, safety, tranquility, and peace. And really, the whole idea of spirituality itself has to do with this idea of tranquility and peace. Okay? So when we say iman, we're talking about tranquility, peace, security, safety on this kind of spiritual, in this spiritual notion of peace and tranquility. But it's not limited to just a spiritual notion of peace and tranquility. And this is where the distinguishing quality of Islam comes up, the distinguishing quality of Islam as a worldview. In other words, you have your modern gurus, whether you're talking about Sadhguru, whether you're talking about, Tony Robbins, or, whoever it may be, that what they're trying to do is they're trying to give this amana, right? This state of peace and security by various means, by, giving them hopefulness about the future, and, you can conquer it all, and so on and so forth. But where the Islamic paradigm, the Islamic worldview differs is that when we think of iman, it's not just this spiritual type of stability, peace, and tranquility, but it's a much deeper type of peace, tranquility, security, and safety. And what do I mean? when we think about it, it's two types of stability and tranquility and peace. You have that spiritual stability, that spiritual tranquility and peace, but you also have a rational component. So remember, I was saying that while our approach should not be Tao of Functionalism, where we're now looking at the human being as a robot, but we cannot be devoid of rationality either, right? It must work in tandem. Because imagine someone that they now feel like, so for instance, I was watching a certain YouTube video and someone was asking about how Christian spirituality helped them. And the person was mentioning that I used to be very addicted to a certain drug, and I would constantly need this drug, and so every time I would take this drug, every time I think he was mentioning heroin, I would get this warm feeling, but I kept on needing it over and over and over again until I found Jesus. And then that warm feeling, that blanket that I needed, was just Jesus, right? Now, from that person's experience, we understand that he experienced that. One of the things is we're not going to deny that individual's experience. We're not going to say, oh, that experience itself is wrong or that experience is fake. But the point is that what is the interpretation of that experience? Was it Jesus? Was it Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What was the interpretation? And how do you tell which interpretation a person's going to make of that experience that's very real, that we do not deny? How are we going to understand it? What is the other aspect that you need to this? And that's where rational stability comes in. Because you could have that spiritual experience and you experienced it, it's very real, but let's say the rational aspect of the Trinity, for instance, that's going to cause instability. It's going to be, you're going to have disquietude from that perspective, a rational perspective. And so, you can take it and put it in a box called, unsolved problems and lock it away and hang it in abeyance. The problem is it's still there though. And so are you really stable from the point of view of like what we said, amana, having that stability and having that true deeper peace and deeper tranquility? So when we talk about iman, we say that it's related to the term or comes from the term amana, which has to do with not only spiritual tranquility, but also having to do with rational stability. And this is going to be very important moving forward. Okay. So that being said, so I just wanted to actually highlight that this concept of rationality and spirituality, you find this throughout our tradition, throughout the Islamic sources. And so when we look at the Quran, for instance, you find whenever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions knowledge, and I would urge you to look through the Quran and see for yourself. Whenever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions the aql, or mentions knowledge, or mentions, knowing something, mentions epistemological principles or something of this nature, you will always find something connected to spirituality around the ayah or within the ayah itself. So a very famous ayah that's usually quoted in books, so for instance, books about like Kitab al-Ilm, Imam al-Ghazali mentions this. Actually, there's a Kitab al-Ilm by Sheikh ibn Uthaymeen as well, who also mentioned this. And they mention this very ayah that you see on the screen. But they mention part of the ayah. The part that they mention, because their focus is on knowledge, they mention the last part of the ayah. هل يستوي الذين يعلمون والذين لا يعلمون? Is the one who knows equal to the one who doesn't know? But you see, right before that, in the very same ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions something else. That's as if it's kind of coupling two things together. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَمَّنْ هُوَ قَانِتٌ أَنَاءِ اللَّيْلِ سَاجِدًا وَقَائِمًا. And, is the one who is qanitun, devoutly obedient, أَنَاءِ اللَّيْلِ, throughout the night, sajidan wa qa'iman, standing, prostrating and standing, right? So is the one who's devoutly obedient, at night, who's standing and prostrating, he's qa'iman yahdhuru al-akhirah, and he's hoping, he's fearing the hereafter. Actually, the translation is right there. He's fearing the وَيَرْجُو رَحْمَةَ رَبِّي, and he's fearing, he's hoping in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, mercy of his Lord. Okay? So, in other words, is the one who's devoutly obedient, standing and prostrating at night, all right, uh, fearful of the hereafter, the consequences of their morality and moral actions and things like that. وَيَرْجُو رَحْمَةَ رَبِّي, and hoping for the mercy of their Lord. Is that person equivalent to the one who doesn't do this? And then Allah says, هَلْ يَسْتَوِي الَّذِينَ يَعْلَمُونَ وَالَّذِينَ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. This is the one who knows equivalent to the one who doesn't know. In other words, you have a spiritual reality. These are all spiritual concepts, spiritual acts, for instance, and both external acts and internal acts. So the first part, amman huwa qanitun ana'i al-layli sajidan wa qa'iman, the one who's standing, the one who's prostrating and standing. These are physical acts, but these are physical, spiritual acts. And then you have internal acts, yahdhurul akhirah, fearing. That's an internal state of the heart that you understand you as a human being, that you fall short and you have, certain things that you didn't, you weren't the best in, and you didn't worship Allah as you should have worshipped, and so on and so forth. So you have you're fearful, you wronged a person. All those things come inside that person's heart, this internal spiritual state, yahdhurul akhirah, that you're fearing the hereafter. وَيَرْجُو رَحْمَةَ رَبِّي, and that you're hopeful for the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Those are all spiritual acts. There's all spiritual acts and spiritual emotions and spiritual, psycho-spiritual states that Allah ties with knowledge. So again, what the reason I'm bringing this up, and we can see this over and over again. The Prophet ﷺ says, there's a dua that the Prophet ﷺ teaches. He says, Allahumma arina al-haqqa haqqa warzuqna ittiba' wa arina al-batila batila warzuqna ijtinaba. Oh Allah, show me truth as truth. Here we go. We're talking about truth, knowledge, rationality, whatever. Show me truth as truth and allow me to follow it. Let me follow it, and show me falsehood as falsehood and keep me away from it. But interestingly enough, it's a dua. He's asking Allah for that. There's a spiritual component. Dua is, a spiritual act. That's both, an act, external act, and an internal act. And so on and so forth. There's many examples that, we don't really have the time to expound upon all of them. The point being is that when it comes to one understanding Iman, that there is a deep connection between rational stability and spiritual tranquility. And these are constantly connected in our tradition, in the Quran and in the Sunnah, and so on and so forth. So now moving on. So we talked about Iman. We talked about that sort of internal tranquility, stability on a rational level, on a spiritual level. So now let's speak about kind of the crux of the matter, and that is ihsan. So the term itself, ihsan, just very quickly, it comes from the triliteral root hasana, which means good or to beautify. And you can compare it to the term jamil, for instance, because jamil is another word that is used in Arabic to say that something is beautiful, right? So if you want to say something nice to your wife, you can say anti jamila, right? And I encourage all the husbands to say that to their wives. Alhamdulillah, right? So the concept of, but generally, when we talk about the term hasan, and we compare to the term jamil, something is, that's beautiful versus beautiful of a nature that's these are two different concepts. All right, now how are they different? The term hasana not only refers to like an external beauty, but would also refer to an internal beauty. So it's not only just beauty of like a physical beauty, one that is seen, one that is delightful to the eyes, but it also refers to a beauty that's deeper inside a person, right? So that beauty can come from a good moral character of a person. The person is truthful and honest and loving and caring. And so this person has hasana, like they're hasan, right? They're beautiful inside and out. Yeah. And so that's why the concept of ihsan can also refer to excellence. That there's a spiritual excellence. And this spiritual excellence has to do with the very idea of that you're not only that you have this not only this external beauty that's manifest when that internal spiritual struggle is kind of is constantly happening, and you're constantly going higher and higher in levels up and closer to Allah, that becomes manifest externally. So you see someone and they pray, but when you see them pray, it's just it's beautiful, right? But there's ihsan there, right? There's excellence in that particular prayer or in that particular act of worship. Or when you see a person, they say that person has nur on their face or whatever it might be, that might be because of the night prayers and so on and so forth. So ihsan is a concept that is, it's quite multifaceted in the sense that it's referring to a type of beauty. And that's, by the way, that's why you can do ihsan to other people or ihsan to Allah, right? Is that you can treat like ihsan to your parents, right? That term is used for that particular purpose, and that's why it's it has that ability to be used in different contexts and in different ways. So that being the case, when we talk about ihsan, coming from the point of view of spirituality, it includes the concept of beauty and kindness and love and so on and so forth, right? The type of ihsan, when the Prophet ﷺ says, it is to worship Allah as if you see him. For even though you do not see him, he sees you. If that's the case, what did the Prophet ﷺ mean to see Allah? Now, obviously, he says, even though you don't see him, we're not talking about ocular vision. We're not talking about seeing Allah like you can see something like I can see the camera or I can see the screen. But yet the Prophet ﷺ uses that phraseology, uses those terms. It's to worship Allah as if you can see him. And this is where I wanted to move on to the concept of Islamic spirituality, from understanding what do we mean by seeing Allah. Because we're not talking about ocular vision. There's something much deeper that we're speaking about. Okay, so let's move on to, very quickly, the ontology of the soul. And this is when we're going to start speaking about what does it mean to, in a sense, see Allah. Obviously, we don't see Allah. We only physically see Allah by way of our ocular senses. Seeing Allah is a phenomenon of the hereafter, not of this dunya. Anyway, so I wanted to touch upon the ontology of the soul very briefly from an understanding of what's known as Ayat Nur. And this particular ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. Mathalu nurihi ka mishkat. The example of his light is like a mishkat. Now, a mishkat is like a niche that's in a wall, right? So back in the olden days, they would put a lamp in a kind of an indent in the wall, or an engraved indent in the wall, to basically focus the light. So if you have a lamp, the light's going everywhere. If you put it in the indent, it's going to focus it in a certain place, right? So this particular, so the example of his light is like a niche within which is, and the translation says within which is a lamp, but really what it's speaking about is a misbah. Misbah comes from the term subh, which means like morning. It's that which emulates the morning, right? So here it's speaking about the flame, in fact, not about the lamp. And we know this because right after that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Al-misbahu fi zujaja, that the misbah is in a glass, okay? And this zujaja, az-zujajatu ka'annaha kawkab, that this zujaja is like a star, that's a pearly white star, that's a glittering star, and that it is lit by a tree that is neither of the east nor of the west. Okay, and it's a blessed tree. So a blessed tree, neither of the east nor of the west. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and the oil that's lighting this flame is blessed olive oil of a blessed olive tree. And that oil itself, it's as if it itself is going to catch on fire, right? So it has a certain shimmer, a certain shine, that if like it could just catch on fire itself. And then Allah says, Nurun ala nur, light upon light, and Allah guides to his light even whomever he wills. And Allah presents examples, amthal linnas, examples for people, and Allah is the knower of all things. So what does this refer to? And again, I'm going to move through this relatively quickly. So I want you to take a look at this diagram, okay? So when we're looking at Ayat Nur, we see that particular flame that was being referred to, that is the ruh, that is the soul, that is the spirit of the human being. The glass is referring to the heart of the human being. The niche, right, indentation in the wall where you put the lamp, that is the torso, the upper torso of the human being, this area right here, the chest. Okay? The olive oil is referring to the fitra, which we spoke about. Okay? And when Allah says nurun ala nur, He's referring to the nur of your ruah, which is fueled by the fitra, fueled here, I'm in quotations, and the light of revelations. Nurun ala nur. Okay? When this human construct that we've been given an example of by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's very profound, because when we think about the concept of the ruh, it is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created, what we would say ex nihilo. In other words, there are two types of creative processes. So Allah creates by way of His amr, right? By His, whenever He decrees a matter, whenever He says, whenever He decrees a matter, He merely says to it, kun fayakun, right? So then it's ex nihilo. It happens. It's created out of nothing. As opposed to other creations that have a time element, and that there's, let's say, pre-existing material that is used to create a particular being, right? So for instance, the human being itself, you have the component of the ruh, which, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِن رُوحِي, and when we breathed and when we breathed the spirit into Adam alayhi salam, then we told the angels to prostrate to Adam alayhi salam. So there's the component of the ruh, and then there's the component of the body. In the very famous hadith that you can find in most hadith collections, where the Prophet ﷺ mentions the creation of the baby, you mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ mentions this, various creative stages from alaqa to mudgha and so on and so forth, and ascribes certain number of days, 40 days, and so on and so forth, and that all has a time process. But when it comes to the ruh, it's the angel that comes and puts the ruh into the body, right? So these are two different kind of creative processes that are part and parcel of the human being. You have the external body and you have the internal ruh. Now, this external body is just like any other animal's body, okay? In other words, just like animals have the desire to eat, to sleep, to fornicate, and so on and so forth, the human being has those as well. That's part of our animal or bodily constitution, right? Our material constitution. At the same time, because we have a ruh that is fueled by the fitra, we also have a moral component. We have a spiritual component, right? So comparing the two, when you look at the animal kingdom, you don't see a lion, chasing down a gazelle, and the gazelle says, in the middle of the chase, saying, "Stop!" to the lion and saying, "I find what you're doing morally reprehensible," right? Because there's no concept of morality. When it comes to the animal kingdom, desires and their, they basically obey what their desires tell them to do, right? And that's how Allah created them. However, when it comes to the human being, there is a ruhani constitution. There is a spiritual constitution in addition to a bodily constitution. And that ruhani constitution, that spiritual constitution, is what gives the human beings limits. Because desires in and of themselves are blind. A desire is a desire. You have a desire to eat, or a desire to have marital relations, or a desire to do this. That desire itself is blind. What gives it its limitations is the moral component, or the ruh component, the ruhani component. So this ruh that is in every single human being, it is trying to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you can see this kind of like an outward force on the heart itself, right? And this outward force is trying to connect with Allah, and that connection happens by way of revelation. So the ruh is having this outward push on the heart, and it can connect with revelation. However, there is an opposing force on the heart, and that has to do with one's nafs, that is related to their desires, their bodily, base animal desires, which is having the opposite push on the heart. And so therefore, you find that the heart is constantly in a state of motion, right? That's why the heart is known as qalb, taqallub. It is always in the state of overturning, right? Qallaba yuqallibu, right? Like to overturn. In fact, the word for revolution in Arabic, one of the words for revolution is inqilab, to overturn, right? So the heart is always in this state, and even the physical heart is always in a state of motion, right? Always beating. And so the heart is sometimes expanding, contracting, right? And so too is the spiritual heart, because you have this outward push by the ruh, and then you have this kind of external factors that are pushing upon the heart, and that comes from the person's bodily desires or animalistic desires that a person has. Now, here's the thing. There is an effect on the heart that is that when a person sins, because remember, we said, what are the things that take a person away from their original normative disposition? So we said one is one's environment. So we can see that right off the bat, the environment has an impact on your nafs, your bodily desires, your culture, your worldview. If you think like sexual relations with anyone and everyone is okay, that's going to have an effect on the heart. Similarly, sins has an effect on the heart. And we know this because the Prophet ﷺ says that when the son of Adam sins, a black dot is placed on the heart. So remember, in our diagram here, we said that the heart was the glass that surrounds the flame. We attached that to the heart. We said that was the heart. Think of that in the sense that if a black dot is placed upon a glass and you have revelation that's coming in, if enough black dots are upon this glass, you cannot have the light of the ruh connecting with the light of revelation. And that's why the recommendation for many scholars is that if you are finding a hard time connecting with the Quran or spiritual acts in general, it's a good time to make tawbah, to clear away those sins, right? Anyhow, so that being the case, we have an understanding, hopefully, albeit a bit briefly, of the human constitution, the ontology of the soul. Okay, now let's come back to the concept of worshiping Allah as if you see Him, right? Because this idea of the ruh and its connection with revelation, notice you're not watching the revelation, but it's something that's attracting the heart directly. In fact, the very concept of an ayah is a sign. And so a sign points out something that's already there, right? Your fitra, the ruh, that we already have the truth. Either we have the disposition for the truth, or we have the truth within us as knowledge, or perhaps proto-knowledge. So that particular truth, like when we think about this particular truth, that it's going to be inclined towards something outside of itself, like revelation or whatever it might be. Anyway, so how exactly is it that we worship Allah even though we don't see Him, right? It's to see Allah, to worship Allah as if we see Him. Because there is the concept of ocular sight, and then there's a concept of spiritual sight, what we may call insight. And this comes from the ruh itself. It's the ability to see things, right? And Imam al-Ghazali, he says, and this is where it kind of ties in the concept of ihsan and seeing, the idea of seeing Allah. He says, now man is composed of a body which perceives with ocular vision, what in Arabic is called basar, and a spirit, ruh, and a soul, nafs, which perceive with inner sight, basira, or we can also say sapience, right? Each of these things has an aspect and a form which is either ugly or beautiful, right? Furthermore, and this is important, why does he mention ugly versus beautiful? Because you can see certain things that you immediately recognize to be ugly or beautiful. So that has to do with ocular sight. But you can also feel certain things. In other words, your ruh will testify to certain things as being ugly or beautiful. And hence the concept of ihsan comes in. So, so he says that each of the things has an aspect and a form which is either ugly or beautiful. Furthermore, the soul which perceives with inner sight is of greater worth than the body which sees with ocular vision. And that's really the point here, is that what spirituality and what we're talking about here has to do with something that's deeper and more inclined towards a person kind of seeing the truth, and here I'm saying it in quotation marks, than something that may be just distinct discursive reasoning or something you can just prove right out of the bat, right? Okay, so we've taken a look at that. We've taken a look at the ruh. let me just touch on something just to elucidate the point. So when we speak about the ruah, I'm trying to see how to express this in the best form. We're speaking about a certain like a so let's take a look at the concept of ayat. When you look at let's say a beautiful sunset, now you're gonna, let's say, be with your loved one, and you might say, okay, well, that's beautiful, look at that beautiful sunset. And your loved one, imagine they say, that's the ugliest thing I ever saw. Prove to me rationally that that is beautiful. The point is that there's no rational proof of that, right? That's something you kind of sense internally. Okay, it's an ayah. Now, one of the function of ayat is that they are attracted, or they're targeted towards the fitrah. And so that's why the natural world can be a sign. The Quran has signs, or ayat. And what a sign does, there's two kind of functions of a sign, two functions of an ayah. Number one, or two phenomena that go together with an ayah. Number one is that there is no time element. Like with an ayah, you don't, you're not going to take time to like ponder upon, and then it's like, okay, now no, it happens immediately, right? That's number one. And number two, it touches on something that's already there. So to give an example, and I've given an example many times, that is that imagine now that, after 10, 20 years after my graduation from college, 10, 20 years later, I'm unpacking some of my boxes and I find my gown, my graduation gown, the one I wore for my graduation. Now, immediately when I see the gown, I'm taken back to the day I graduated. I remember, the look on my parents' face, right? That they were proud. I remember, the place I was sitting. I remember the fact that my last name starts with a T, and I had to wait for 200 people before I was able to go up and get my degree. All of those things come back immediately because of something that was already there. That memory, that whatever memory was there, and that gown becomes an ayah. So there's no time element, and there's no information transfer. I didn't just learn something new. It was something that was already extant. It was already there. It was already present, right? And so too, when it comes to the fitrah, that knowledge or proto-knowledge of Allah is already there. And so when you see an ayah, it's not just a rational argument that therefore now there is, but it has a direct type of connection, right? And hence the ruh, and you can say, like, by extension, the fitrah has a type of perception that is a better and greater perception than just ocular perception. And I'm not sure if I actually expounded upon that in a way that was understandable, but hopefully we can expound upon that more in the Q&A, inshallah. But I thought this was very powerful from Imam al-Ghazali. All right, so we're going on. I want to make sure that we leave some time open for Q&A. Let me give you an example of a spiritual experience. So all of this whole discussion has to do with when you are calling someone or inviting someone to the truth, to Islam. And so one of the ways we can do that is by way of inviting people to spiritual experiences or spiritual acts that someone may do. One of the most popular ones, at least on college campuses here in the US, is the fastathon. I don't know if you guys have a fastathon or you do fastathons. And, so non-Muslims are always invited to fast with the Muslims. But what I find missing in those is that while they may experience the fast, they may not understand the spiritual significance of the fast. And usually when we explain the fast, we do it in somewhat of a superficial way, or a way that doesn't really highlight the reality of the fasting itself, right? So an explanation we might give is, we fast to feel what it's like to be poor, to increase us in our compassion. That's one of the outcomes of fasting, inshallah. Although I would argue that sometimes that maybe you may not have that. That may not be the outcome of fasting, because at the end of the day, when you open your fast, you have a meal, you have your samosas and pakoras and Allah knows what, right, that are waiting for you. Whereas someone who's truly poor does not have that. So yes, while you're fasting, maybe that might be the experience that you have, and maybe that would increase you in compassion. But there's a deeper spiritual understanding that one needs to have when they're fasting, especially if you're coming from a paradigm outside of Islam. So I wanted to give an example of that, and that is the fasting itself. So what is the spiritual significance of fasting? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ. So here we're talking about the ruah, we're talking about spirituality. They ask you concerning the ruah. قُل, say, the ruh, الruh min amri rabbi. Say that the ruh is from the amr of Allah, the command of Allah. Okay? And so one thing we understand that the ruh is from the amr of Allah, from the command of Allah. And I was touching upon this a bit earlier when I was speaking about the different processes of creation, right? So the ruh comes from an amr, from a command. Okay? What is the command? Right? As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Baqarah, بديع السماوات والأرض وإذا قضى أمرا فإنما يقول له كن فيكون. That he is the originator. And it's interesting that he uses the term بديع السماوات والأرض, because بديع comes from origination out of nothing, right? That's why the term bid'ah is an innovation. Like it didn't exist before, and now you just came up with it, right? So Allah is بديع السماوات والأرض. He creates out of nothing. And he mentions what? How does that creative process happen? Right? So he says that إِذَا قَضَى أَمْرًا, when he decrees a matter, okay? فَإِنَّمَا يَقُولُ لَهُ كُن فَيَكُونُ. That he only says to it, فَإِنَّمَا, which signifies exclusivity, فَإِنَّمَا يَقُولُ لَهُ كُن فَيَكُونُ. He merely says to it, be. In other words, when you're going to have a creative process ex nihilo, in other words, creating out of nothing, creating by the amr of Allah, he merely says to it, be, and it is. In other words, by way of his kalam, by way of his word. So the ruh is by the command of Allah. And that command happens by way of kun fayakun, the speech of Allah, the kalam of Allah, right? So that being the case, so why is that significant? What happens in Ramadan? Well, number one, remember we said that you have an animalistic reality, a bodily material reality, and it has its own desires and so on and so forth. And then you have the ruh, okay? So the animal body that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created, remember we said that it went through a process. And much like animals go through a process and so on and so forth. So, and yet the ruh that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts in the human being is by way of his amr. Here's the thing, in Ramadan, it's as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, 11 months out of the year, you eat and you drink and you do whatever you want, right? And if we were to take a horse motif, in other words, like an analogy based on a horse and a rider, and that's why this is in the picture, your body, your material body with its desires is like the horse. The ruh is like the rider, the one that's riding the horse and trying to control the horse. 11 months out of the year, the horse, because you've been feeding it like all the food, right? So when you think about your material body, where does the food come from? The food comes from where it came from. The material body was created from earth, deen, etc. But body was created from the earth. It gets its food from the earth, right? So you're gonna get vegetables and fruits, and all that is from an earthly material. So when it needs sustenance, when it needs support, it's going to be taken from the place that it came from, which is the earth, right? So it gets its sustenance from the earth. And so 11 months out of the year, this horse that has been fed all 11 months out of the year, it's running wild like crazy. Why? Because of the rider perhaps isn't that strong. Because the rider needs to be strengthened. So how do you strengthen the rider? Well, you give the rider food from its source. The rider here being the ruh. Where does the rider get its source? Where does the ruh get its sustenance? From its source. What is the source? The amr of Allah. And how does Allah issue awamir? How does Allah issue commands? Kun fayakun, by the kalam. Do we have access to that kalam? Yeah, the Quran. So how do you strengthen the rider? It's by way of Quran, right? So the Quran, remember, nurun ala nur, light upon light. So you strengthen the rider by way of Quran. So what happens in Ramadan? You take food away from the horse because you're fasting, and you're spending the day weakening the horse, and you're spending the nights in Taraweeh strengthening the rider, right? And so we find that the very purpose of fasting isn't just to feel how the poor feel, but rather it has a deep spiritual significance because it's supposed to elevate. So if we were to say, as an example, inviting someone to fast, it's not only inviting someone to fast, but connecting the idea of fasting to spirituality. What is the phenomena here? What are we trying to do, right? When we're fasting, we understand that there's a bodily component, there's an animalistic reality, and then there you can say is an angelic reality, right? The ruah, and strengthening the ruah. And so really highlighting the concept of that that dynamic, that interplay between the ruah and the body, and so on and so forth. So one way would be to expose someone to fasting, right? Invite them to fast. Expose someone to the Quran, because we understand that the Quran is multifaceted, multi-layered, and not only its wording and the arguments that it presents, but it's multi-layered in the sense that its acoustics are something that are attractive to the heart, to the ruah, right? Nurun ala nur, the light of revelation upon the light of the ruah. So its acoustics are attractive, its meaning is attractive, its structure is attractive, its recitation is attractive, the prayer one does by reciting the Quran is attractive, and so on and so forth, attractive to the ruah. So having someone exposed to the Quran, witnessing the Taraweeh prayers. Now here's the thing, and this is the last point I'll make. So we spoke about the human being, spirituality. Hopefully we gave a good understanding of Islamic spirituality. Now, what if someone comes and says, well, I've had spiritual experiences? Up to this, hopefully we've now understood that spiritual experiences you can have them, but that doesn't mean that will lead to true spirituality, true iman in a sense, or even ihsan, because ihsan is based upon iman, which we said was stability. What kind of stability? Spiritual tranquility and stability, but also rational stability and security. So if someone says, I've had a spiritual experience, we're not going to deny that experience. You don't say like, no, you didn't experience it, because they did. You can't deny someone's personal, first person experience that they've had. But what you would encourage the person to do is to stand in the possibility that there's a different interpretation, one that is more holistic, that gives you tranquility rationally and spiritually, by way of your knowledge and by way of your heart, mind, and soul, right? And body from one perspective, right? And so having the person saying, look, you have this particular experience, like someone, like I was mentioning about the person who said I was addicted to drugs and so on and so forth, by saying like, look, is it possible that that spiritual experience you had has more to do with the one true God, and that one true God is the one who brought you that tranquility, and also it's very clear about who that one God is, right? That he is Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, and he is one, and he's not three in one, and so on and so forth, right? So encouraging the person to stand in the possibility that there's a different explanation, or there's a different meaning to the spiritual experience that they might have had, right? So someone says, I experienced Jesus, right? Standing in the possibility that there's a different meaning to their spiritual experience, right? Understanding that they're coming from a specific worldview, and that their paradigm is going to have an effect on how they understand something. So just having the person stand in the possibility, the explanation that they've given their spiritual experience, there may be another explanation, right? So that basically is what I wanted to basically cover. We can look and see if there's any sort of questions. Let's see. So it looks like a lot of questions as I was speaking. So, all right. Let's see here. So someone said, you are actually refuting the attribute of Allah, He's Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. So I don't really see how I'm refuting that. Are you saying I'm refuting that, or you as the da'iyah is refuting that? I don't follow. Let's see. So someone asked, can you say that the experience was just merely a dream? I think that would be kind of difficult to say, because people understand dream states. They know when they go to sleep and they're dreaming. I think it might be difficult. I think a better explanation would be to say that that the interpretation is something else, right? I mean, I had to have more of a specific example, because some experiences which people consider to be spiritual, in fact, are not really spiritual from a true spirituality understanding, right? So someone say, look, I took a mushroom and I had these crazy experiences. I saw aliens and things like that. Okay, but perhaps that short-lived experience that you had has a different explanation. It has more to do with the neurochemicals or whatever it might be, and that things that you're seeing are just not really the explanation that's correct, right? Or what explanation that you've given it. Now, I'm not sure what explanation they would give it, but it would depend on what they would say the explanation is. Or taking something like, I don't know, ghosts. I saw ghosts, even though that's not really a spiritual experience. But if someone says I saw a ghost, be like, yeah, okay. And so, what sort of interpretation do you give that particular experience? Well, there's someone who came back from the dead, and so on and so forth. Okay, but is it possible that that can be explained by the Islamic paradigm, and then you can speak about jinn and so on and so forth? But I don't know if that would constitute as a spiritual experience. I think a spiritual experience is more of something that's very personal. Allah knows best. So, any other questions? Let's see. So, if you did ask some questions, go ahead and repost them if you could. I'd appreciate it. Souls is consciousness, nafs is body. A very, very, very simplified way of looking at it, yes. But the issue is that the term nafs uh, within Islamic source material is used in different ways, right? So nafs can include the entire human personality, right? So like the concept of I, like it's an ontological statement, right? So when you say ana or nafsi, like that's myself. It's not referred like we ask like what do you mean by yourself, your nafs? So nafs can refer to the self itself, right? Like this is yourself itself. It can refer to the entire personality. In fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses that term to refer to himself, right? But here we're not going to say that he's a'udhu billah, some sort of a body, right? Obviously, he's referring to the idea of him being like a being, right? So, وَيُحَذِّرُكُمُ اللَّهُ nafsa. So Allah warns you from himself. Here we're talking about self as a separate construct than what we were speaking about. So depending on the context of where we're using the term nafs in Arabic, you're going to have to interpret it like that, right? And Allah knows best. So someone said, what are your thoughts on reciting Quran in public spaces in the West? I think it would depend on where you're reciting it and if the occasion calls for a recitation, right? Sometimes it can be quite it can have the opposite effect, meaning that that if you're in a busy place and um, maybe people might not appreciate it, right? Especially if people are in the middle of something, they're doing something, trying to listen to something. But if it's a public place, I don't know. Again, I think it'd be very situational. It depend. Allah knows best. Any other questions? Can we have a seminar on philosophy of Islam? Seems like a very big topic, but what I'll recommend is that our brother Muhammad Hijab is doing a series called Londoniya, which he's written a poem and he's explaining from that poem theophilosophical points related to Islam and its comparison to other philosophies that are out there that run antagonist to Islam. So I think the recent one he did was on feminism, etc. So do we have priorities in terms of which methodology to choose from when giving dawah? Like the ones you gave, which do we prioritize? So again, it's going to be very situational. I don't know if you could say you prioritize one. Obviously, you're going to prioritize Tawheed. That's not necessarily Tawheed in the sense that um, as a rational argument, because when we understand Tawheed, we understand it that there's a certain concept of Tawheed, right? That is the bare minimum that you need to present to someone, at least give them the understanding of what Tawheed is. Um, and this is and really that's what you're obligated to do. Now, that being the case, there's going to be different ways of how you present what Tawheed really is. What does it mean? Like we just got done speaking about Iman, um, but essentially we're tying it to Tawheed. So it's going to depend on the person. Like, are they a spiritual person? Some people, they are very kind of analytical in how they look at the world and things like that. And for them, rational arguments might be the way to go. Some people are less analytical. Some people need more spiritual experiences. So it really is going to depend upon the person themselves, how much you know about them, their own culture and background. What I think is really fascinating. I was uh, reading a little bit about um, uh, Al Birnuni, right? I think that's how you say his name. And he was the one that accompanied Mahmud al Ghaznawi when they went and went and took over India. At the time, if you know Mahmud al Ghaznawi, he did 17 excursions deep in the heart of India. So he had a scholar with him, and that scholar wrote a quite an extensive tract on what you would call like the Hindu practices of that time period. But what's interesting is that he wrote it in such a way to understand that these people have X, Y, and Z ideas. Like they have certain sha'ir, they have certain symbols. And to understand what their symbols are, it means to understand how to make dawah to them the best. And so a lot of the dawah that was done, sometimes it went to some extremes, but had to do with more of a spiritual type of presentation of Islam, right? For the idea that understanding that that's where the background was of the people that they're addressing. So it really depends. I mean, you're going to have to kind of see what the background of the person is, where they're coming from, what culture they're from, and so on and so forth. Allah knows best. Let's see. Any other questions? I think we have a few more minutes, if there are any. Oh, this is a good one. Can experiential signs be objective? Right. I think that's a tough call, right? I would say certain signs can be objective, but objective in what sense? So I would argue, and I've argued this in the seminar which I did on beauty and the recognition of God, that the natural world, recognizing beauty in the natural world is most definitely objective. However, beauty in the hands of human beings like art and things like that, that's definitely going to be subjective, right? And we know this not necessarily through some sort of discursive reasoning. We know this by way of experience, right? So the objectivity of nature is something we see all around us. When people are trying to sell us cereal, they say it's all natural, right? Or they're selling us whatever, right? Protein powder, all natural, whatever it might be. But why? Like it's almost as if all natural or nature is a type of meta phenomenon, right? So they have the concept of the true, the good, and the beautiful. So you can't say something is true is your baseline, right? Uh, Toshiko Zutsu, in his book, the ethical, what do you say? The something ethical, something concepts in Islam or in the Quran. He mentions that there are certain terms that are like they're meta terms, and they are secondary, and you have primary terms that are built upon it, right? And so you have, for instance, good. Now, you use good as your starting point, you build terms upon it. So you say, okay, so a massage would be good. Okay, well, would good be good? Okay, but that's your lowest point. You can't go beyond good, right? Similarly, truth. I believe X because it's true. Well, is true true? You see how? So then you also have beauty. You can't say like, oh, I look at something because it's beautiful. Is beauty beautiful? So you understand that. So from that perspective, I would say you could say natural beauty would be objective. Like you experience natural beauty, and that's an objective experience, right? Whereas human-made beauty, it has certain things that make it intrinsically subjective. So, for instance, it's subjective from the point of view that when someone is painting, even if they're painting a mountain, it's going to be framed. So you're looking at it from the subjective view of the person that's doing the painting, right? Because it's got framing. Whereas in the natural world, there is no framing. It's just vast, right? The vastness of nature is there's no framing. There's no kind of human perspective with the exception of your own, right? So from that perspective, I would say it's objective. It can be objective, and Allah knows best. So you like the word order better. Maybe you're more analytical, man. I don't know. I look at it and say, "Wow, it's beautiful, Jamil." I don't know if I would go to my wife and say, "You look very orderly today." Anyway, okay. All right. Any other questions? I'm going to try to scroll up here and see. Okay, so you've got a question, but I think it's outside the scope of what we're speaking about, right? So you said, how can you prove to an atheist the existing of consciousness? Where'd it go? And how it's related to the soul and nafs. Well, see, again, when we come to this whole concept of trying to prove something to someone, I think that sort of discourse, it's it becomes sometimes it can be counterproductive, right? Because the very idea of, okay, I'm going to prove this to a person or prove that to a person, um, try to transcend that sort of verbiage that, okay, I'm going to prove consciousness or improve that. Consciousness is something that, yani, a person who's conscious, they know they're conscious, right? It's not really a phenomena that you're going to sit there and say, oh, let me prove consciousness to you, because you're gonna enter into a rabbit's hole trying to do that, right? As far as the soul and the nafs and things like that, I mean, to be very honest, the type of certainty you would get by way of experience is at a higher level than what you may get as a rational endeavor. Like, I'll give you an example. So, in the Islamic framework, we know that there are three levels of yaqeen, three levels of certainty, right? You have ilm al-yaqeen, ayn al-yaqeen, and haqq al-yaqeen. So ilm al-yaqeen is a rational certainty, right? So just to take the quintessential example, everyone knows they're going to die, like death. You know that. You understand that that's a reality. You're going to die, right? Very few people think, okay, well, I'm going to live forever, you know, especially when you get older, right? Or maybe as a young person, you might think that, or you might not even think about it at all. But you have that as you're certain about that. Now, when the angel of death is knocking at your door and you see the angel of death, you have ainul yaqeen. You can see the angel of death, right? And so now you're even more sure. And then when you have the experience of your soul being pulled out of your body, you can't be any more sure because of the experience you directly had, right? So ilmul yaqeen, ainul yaqeen, haqqul yaqeen, right? And this is kind of a nice construct of understanding certainty as well. That you can give someone knowledge, like Ibn al-Qayyim mentions something really interesting. He says, imagine if you never tasted sugar. Now, you have a good friend, you trust him, you know him, he is like your best friend, he's the most honest person you know, and he tells you sugar tastes great, it's very sweet, right? And you say, okay, well that's good. So now you have a certain knowledge of sugar being sweet, like because you have testimonial knowledge. He told you and you trust him and so on and so forth. And then you see that sugar is used in certain desserts. So you see that this person is putting sugar in cake or whatever it might be. So now you're like, okay, so your certainty has increased. They wouldn't use sugar unless they're going to make dessert, right? And then you taste sugar. Now that direct experience of tasting sugar has increased your yaqeen to its apex, right? So my point in mentioning that is that, you know, it's the whole kind of verbiage that we use about proving this or proving that. I think it's time we kind of transcend that and we try to have a more holistic approach, inshallah, right? Because frankly, trying to prove the consciousness, I don't know. That's a tough one. Let's see. So let's do one more question, inshallah, if anyone has one. And if not, let's see. Let's see. So quite, you mean that? Okay. So, okay, good deal. All right, I think that's good. So we'll go ahead and end it here, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you, bless all of you for attending. If it got a bit monotonous and boring in between, my apologies about that. You know, I tried to you know, present the material as best as I could. So if there was some fault or some you know, some mistakes or whatever it might be, that's all from myself or from shaitan. Any sort of benefit, it's all from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah bless you and bless all your families. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.